Jeanne de Saint-Remy de Valois stands in a jeweller's back room in Paris in the winter of 1784, looking at a necklace she has no intention of buying. In the months that follow, she will set in motion a fraud so audacious that it will help bring down a monarchy, destroy the reputation of a queen who never touched the necklace, and end with Jeanne herself branded and imprisoned before she escapes to tell her own version of the story to anyone who will read it. This is a story set in the last years of the French court at Versailles, in the years between 1784 and 1786, when a single object became the instrument of something much larger than itself. At its center is a necklace containing 647 diamonds, a cardinal who had spent years desperate for a queen's forgiveness, and a woman of royal blood who had grown up with nothing. This is the story of the affair of the diamond necklace, told gently, with care for the historical record and respect for those whose lives and whose deaths were shaped by the events of Versailles and Paris in the years between 1784 and 1786. Good evening and welcome. There will be no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, nothing to startle you from rest. If you find comfort in these stories and wish to follow us, please do. Close your eyes whenever you wish. Let your breathing slow. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Her name was Jeanne de Saint-Remy de Valois. She was born in 1756 in a village in Champagne, and she carried royal blood in her veins and nothing else. I want to stay with that for a moment, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. The Valois were the kings of France before the Bourbons. They ruled France for 2.5 centuries. Jeanne's claim ran through an illegitimate line, legitimized at some point, and then largely forgotten. But it was real. It was documented. She was, in some genuine and traceable sense, a descendant of the royal house of France, and she grew up begging on the roads of Champagne. She and her siblings, as children, stopped travelers on the road and asked for charity. There are accounts of a young girl in ragged clothing announcing herself as a Valois and asking for money. Whether that detail is exactly true, I can't say with certainty, but the poverty was real, and the distance between what she was by blood and what she had by circumstance was real, and she felt it. She felt it every day of her life, I think, in the particular way that people feel an injustice that was decided before they were born. At some point in her childhood, she attracted the attention of a noble patron. She received some education. She was taken up, dressed more warmly, given a future that didn't end on the road. And she was intelligent. This is important to say plainly. Whatever she did later, and the record is clear that she did a great deal, she did it with a sharp mind and a remarkable ability to read people, to understand what they wanted, and to present herself as the person who could give it to them. By her early 20s, she had married a man named Nicolas de la Motte, a minor officer who held a title of questionable standing. He called himself the Comte de la Motte. Jeanne became the Comtesse. It was a small fiction held up by ambition and very little else. But in the world she was trying to enter, fictions of that kind were both understood and, up to a point, accepted. Everyone at Versailles was performing something. So she came to Paris, then to Versailles, not as a visitor, not as a tourist of the court, but deliberately, with a plan. She presented herself at Versailles as a person of consequence, a woman of Valois descent, come to take her rightful place in the orbit of the crown. She filed petitions, formal, legal petitions, requesting a royal pension in recognition of her ancestry. The crown acknowledged the descent. The crown said, in various polite and bureaucratic ways, that this was not quite sufficient grounds for a pension. She petitioned again. The answer was the same. She had the blood and not the money. and the crown was not inclined to close the gap. I think about what that does to a person. To be told, repeatedly, through official channels, that what you are owed is not quite enough to be worth paying. The proper channels had been tried. The proper channels had said no. And here she was, in her late 20s, hosting dinners, appearing at Versailles, maintaining the performance of a life she could not actually afford, in a city that ran on appearances and credit, and the willingness of people to believe in what they saw. The necklace existed somewhere in the background of all this. I'll tell you more about it in a moment. But I want you to have Jeanne first, because everything else in this story arrives through her. The necklace was only a necklace until she picked it up. The cardinal was only a disappointed man until she saw what his disappointment could be used for. The queen was only a queen, distant and unreachable, until Jeanne understood how to make distance work in her favor. She was, by any measure, one of the most audacious people in this story, and this story is full of audacious people. She operated in a society that had decided, before she was born, exactly how much she was worth, and she looked at that society and decided to disagree. What she was about to do would unravel the French monarchy's credibility in ways that even she cannot have anticipated. But we're not there yet. We're still in the beginning, before the necklace changes hands, before the letters are forged, before the figure in white stands in the darkness of a garden at Versailles and hands a cardinal a rose. We're still with Jeanne in the early 1780s. Learning the world she had walked into and deciding what to do with it. Chapter 2. The world Jeanne was navigating had one principle at its center, and she understood it completely. At Versailles, proximity to the monarch was the currency of power. Everything else, rank, wealth, influence, office, followed from it. To be in the queen's favor was to have access. To be excluded from the queen's favor was to be present and invisible at the same time, which was, in some ways, worse than being absent altogether. She studied this world the way you study something you intend to use. She understood the daily rituals of court life, the lever and the coucher, the formal ceremonies through which the royal body moved from one state to another while a crowd of courtiers watched. She understood which offices required proximity to the queen and which did not. She understood, with particular clarity, which men and women at court were in favor and which were not, and what the difference cost them. It was through this understanding that she found Cardinal de Rohan. Louis-René Édouard de Rohan was, on paper, one of the most powerful men in France. He was a prince of the House of Rohan, one of the great noble families of the country. He was a cardinal of the Catholic Church. He held the office of Grand Almoner of France, the senior ecclesiastical officer of the royal household, which required his presence at court on major ceremonial occasions. He was tall, distinguished-looking, genuinely pious, and, according to those who knew him well, genuinely kind. He was also, by the time Jeanne found him, a man in a particular kind of quiet misery. He had served as French ambassador to Vienna in the early 1770s, and while he was there he had conducted himself, to put it gently, without sufficient care. He was dissolute, he was indiscreet, he wrote letters that were not meant for other eyes, and that reached other eyes anyway. Empress Maria Theresa, the formidable Austrian queen who was also Marie Antoinette's mother, had found his behavior offensive enough to write to her daughter, warning against him. And so, when Marie Antoinette became Queen of France, she did as her mother advised. She refused to receive Rohan. She would not grant him audience. She would not acknowledge his letters. She would not give him the small, ceremonially meaningful sign of favor that would have allowed him to hold his head up in the world he was required to inhabit every day. He came to court in his cardinal's robes. He celebrated Mass in the royal chapel. He fulfilled every obligation of his office. And the Queen looked past him, every time, as though he weren't there. He had been living in this condition for years by the time Jeanne began cultivating his acquaintance. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think it matters. This was not a man who had been sent into exile, far from the court and the life he knew. He was right there, present, visible, performing his duties with whatever dignity he could muster, in full view of the person whose acknowledgment he needed most and could not obtain. That kind of exclusion, when it goes on long enough, does something particular to a person. It becomes an obsession. The absence of the thing you want grows until it's larger than everything you have. Jeanne saw this. She understood it immediately, and she had something to offer him, or so she told him. She was, she said, a close personal friend of the Queen. She moved in the Queen's private circle. She had the Queen's trust, her warmth, her confidence. She could help. It wasn't true. None of it was true. Jeanne had no special relationship with Marie Antoinette. But the claim was constructed carefully, gradually, over months, and Rohan wanted it to be true so deeply that he made it easier for her than it might otherwise have been. This is also the moment to tell you about Marie Antoinette herself, because she is the absent heart of this story, the person around whom everything turns without her knowledge. She was 29 or 30 at the time of the affair. She had come to France at 14, married to the Dauphin, and she had spent the intervening years becoming the Queen of France in a court that had not made it easy. The daily ceremonial of Versailles required her to perform her role from the moment she woke until the moment she slept, in front of an audience, subject to protocols she had not chosen and could not ignore. She had, gradually, carved out a smaller and more private world for herself at the Petit Trianon, a smaller chateau within the Versailles estate that Louis XVI had given her, where she could receive a chosen circle of companions and breathe a little more freely. Contemporary portraits show a woman of fair coloring and considerable elegance. Those who knew her speak of her intelligence, her genuine affection for her children, and a warmth in private company that was quite different from the formal figure she presented in the state apartments. She also had, by the mid-1780s, accumulated a reputation in popular culture for extravagance that bore only a partial relationship to reality. Pamphlets circulated in Paris calling her Madame d'Efficy. Some of these pamphlets were deeply, viciously unfair. Some of them contained a grain of truth about spending habits that were unwise in a period of national financial strain. She knew about the pamphlets. She found them painful. She had no very effective way of responding to them. She had refused to receive Cardinal de Rohan since her arrival in France. This was deliberate, consistent, and had never wavered. It was also, as the affair would eventually make clear, something that Jeanne had understood as a structural feature of the situation. The Queen's exclusion of Rohan was so complete, so long-standing, that almost anything purporting to represent a change in it would be intensely compelling to a man who had been waiting years for exactly that change. And then there was the necklace. Charles Auguste Boehmer was the crown jeweler of France, and for several years he had been quietly, then less quietly, desperate. He and his business partner Paul Bassange had spent years assembling a diamond necklace of extraordinary size and cost. 647 diamonds. Approximately 2,800 carats in total. A weight of brilliance, set in an elaborate design of festoons and pendants, intended to be the most magnificent piece of jewellery in France. They had built it for Louis XV to give to his mistress, Madame du Barry. Then Louis XV died, and the intended purchaser was gone, and the necklace was in a box worth 1,600,000 livres with no buyer. They tried to sell it to Louis XVI for Marie Antoinette. She declined. She is said to have remarked that France needed ships more than diamonds, though the exact words are not quite certain. What is certain is that she said no, and she said it more than once. Boehmer became desperate in ways that were visible and increasingly alarming. On at least one occasion, he fell to his knees before the Queen and wept, begging her to buy the necklace. She found this distressing and dismissed him. She did not dislike him, I think. She just didn't know what to do with a man in that kind of financial terror, performing it in her private apartments. The necklace sat. The debt it represented sat with it, accumulating quietly. Boehmer needed to sell it, and he needed to sell it soon, and he had run out of obvious buyers. This was the landscape Jeanne was surveying, a cardinal desperate for royal favor, a queen whose name and reputation were the most valuable things in France if you could use them without her permission, a jeweler who had been waiting years for a buyer, and who would not, perhaps, scrutinize the transaction as carefully as he might if he were not frightened, and a woman who had grown up on the roads of Champagne with royal blood and no money, who understood exactly how to make each of these things useful. The forged letters began, I think, sometime in 1783 or early 1784. Jeanne's associate, a former soldier named Rétaux de Villette, wrote them. They were letters purporting to be from Marie Antoinette, addressed to Cardinal de Rohan. They expressed at first only a cautious warmth, a willingness to consider reconciliation, a gradual, tentative movement toward the cardinal's rehabilitation in the Queen's eyes. They were written by candlelight, in careful handwriting, and signed Marie Antoinette de France. Rohan received them, he read them, he wrote back. He kept writing, and the letters kept coming, and each one drew him a little further in. Chapter 3. There came a summer evening in 1784, and I want to take it slowly because this moment is the strangest and the most human in the whole affair. Jeanne had told Rohan that the Queen wished to meet him privately. The reconciliation was progressing, she said. The Queen was genuinely moved by his correspondence. She wished to demonstrate her change of feeling in person. They would meet, quietly, after dark, in one of the enclosed garden rooms in the grounds of Versailles. He was to tell no one. He agreed. He came to Versailles in the summer darkness, on a night the precise date of which different sources give differently. Some say July, some say August. The formal gardens of Versailles were not lit at night, except during festivals. The hedges of the enclosed bosquets were dense and tall, high enough to screen movement from the main paths. The gravel paths were quieter underfoot than the broad alleys. It was a kind of darkness that softens things, that makes detail harder to hold. A young woman named Nicole Aguet d'Oliva was waiting in the Bosquet de Venice. She was approximately 23 years old, a working-class Parisian woman who had been selected, according to sources, because of a physical resemblance to the Queen. She had been dressed in white, a color associated with Marie Antoinette, and positioned in the grove. Whether Nicole fully understood what she was participating in is one of the questions the record cannot answer cleanly. She later testified that she had not been told the whole of what she was doing, and the court largely believed her. Rohan approached through the darkness. He saw a figure in white standing among the hedges. He believed he was looking at the Queen. He approached. She handed him a rose. She spoke a few words. The exact words are not documented anywhere. All we have is Rohan's account and Nicole's, and they differ in their particulars, as memory does and as interest does. The meeting lasted only moments. Sources say it was interrupted. by the approach of two of the Queen's ladies on a nearby path, though even this detail is uncertain in some accounts. The figure in white withdrew. Rohan left the grove. He believed he had met the Queen. He believed she had taken a rose from her own hand and given it to him, in darkness and secret, as a sign of favor restored. He walked back through the gardens of Versailles, carrying that belief with him, and it must have felt like the end of a very long drought. I find this moment one of the saddest in the story, not the deception itself, though that is sad enough. The sadness is in the man, 50 years old, a prince of France, grand almoner to the crown, reduced by years of exclusion to the state where he would follow a woman he barely knew into a dark garden, and accept, without question, a figure in white handing him a rose. He wanted to believe so badly that he had made himself into someone who would believe almost anything that confirmed what he hoped. Jeanne understood this. She had seen it from the beginning. She had built the entire architecture of the scheme around one man's need to be seen. In the months that followed the Grove meeting, she moved toward the necklace. She told Rohan that the Queen wished to acquire it. This was, she said, a private matter. The Queen wanted the necklace, but didn't wish to involve the king, for reasons Jeanne presented as entirely understandable. The Queen's desire for some independence in a matter of personal taste, perhaps. The Cardinal would act as intermediary. The sale would be conducted quietly, with Rohan as guarantor. The Queen would repay the jewelers in installments. Rohan went to Baumer and Bassenge. A contract was drawn up. The purchase price was 1,600,000 livres. The signature on the contract, on behalf of the buyer, read Marie Antoinette de France. Here is a detail I want to leave with you for a moment. No Queen of France signed her name that way. French queens signed only their first name, nothing else. The form, Marie Antoinette de France, was incorrect, and the error was visible there on the contract if anyone had looked for it. Whether Rohan saw it and chose not to see it, whether he saw it and found a reason to accept it, whether he simply didn't look, is one of those questions about a person's inner state that the historical record cannot answer. We know the contract was signed that way. We know Rohan countersigned it as guarantor. We know he handed the contract back and waited for the necklace. On the first day of February 1785, Baumer and Bassenge handed the necklace to Cardinal de Rohan. He handed it that same day to a man he believed to be the Queen's personal servant, come to collect it on her behalf. The man was in fact an associate of Jeanne's. The necklace left the jeweler's premises and passed into other hands, and within days it ceased to exist. I want to give that a moment, because it's a particular kind of loss. This object that had taken years to assemble, 647 stones purchased from various sources across Europe, set into an elaborate design that no other piece of jewelry in France could match, was broken up within days of the transaction. The diamonds were removed from their settings. The settings were discarded or melted. Nicolas de la Motte traveled to London with a portion of the stones and began selling them through the dealers there. The rest were dispersed by other means, across Europe, into the jewelry trade, into the anonymous circulation of valuable stones that leave no trail. The necklace that Baumer had wept over, that Marie Antoinette had twice declined to buy, that had sat in a box for years waiting for a buyer, ceased to exist as a thing in February of 1785. It exists now only in written descriptions and in one or two period drawings. The months between February and July of 1785 must have been, for Jeanne and Nicolas, a period of considerable anxiety held in check by considerable relief. The scheme had worked. The necklace was gone. The money was, or was becoming, real. Then Baumer wrote a letter. The first installment of payment had been due in July. It hadn't arrived. So Beaumont wrote to Marie Antoinette, thanking her for her purchase of the necklace and expressing his hope that she was pleased with it. Marie Antoinette received the letter and couldn't understand it. She showed it to her reader, who couldn't understand it either. She thought it was the confused communication of a man she had previously found unsettling. She burned it. That burning is one of the quiet tragedies of the story. The thread was there, in her hand. The whole structure of the fraud could have been unraveled in July of 1785 if she had known what the letter meant. Instead, she destroyed it and thought no more about it, and the weeks passed, and the fraud stayed intact a little longer. Beaumont, not receiving any payment and increasingly alarmed, eventually sought out Madame Campan, the Queen's first lady of the bedchamber, a woman of considerable intelligence and loyalty who had served Marie Antoinette for years. He told Campan the fuller story. Campan brought it to the Queen. And then Marie Antoinette understood. She understood that someone had used her name to purchase a necklace worth over 1.5 million livres, that someone had forged her signature on a contract of sale, that a cardinal of the church had believed, or claimed to believe, that he was acting as her intermediary in a secret transaction she had never authorized, that a figure had stood in the gardens of Versailles in white clothing and impersonated her, in darkness, to a man who believed he was meeting his queen. She had known nothing about any of it, and now she had to explain that she had known nothing, in a world where people had spent years half believing she was capable of anything. The 15th of August, 1785, was the Feast of the Assumption, one of the most important Catholic feast days in the French court calendar, a day of public ceremony and celebration. Cardinal de Rohan, in his full cardinal's robes, was preparing to celebrate Mass in the royal chapel when he was summoned to the king's private cabinet. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were both present. The forged contract was produced. The Queen denied all knowledge of the necklace, the contract, and the letters. Rohan was asked to explain himself. He began to write an explanation, then was told it could wait. The decision had already been made. He was arrested in the Œil de Bœuf antechamber of the Palace of Versailles in his cardinal's robes on a major feast day before he could leave the building. He was taken to the Bastille. The arrest was public. It was witnessed. News reached Paris within days. The subsequent arrests came quickly. Jeanne was arrested at Barcerobe. Nicole Legois d'Oliva was arrested. Reto de Villette was arrested. Alessandro Cagliostro, the Italian occultist and adventurer who moved in Rohan's social circle, and whose role in the affair was, even then, genuinely unclear, was arrested in Paris. Nicolas de la Motte was in London. He did not return. The trial before the Parlement of Paris lasted the better part of a year. 64 judges heard the case. Written interrogatories were prepared, testimony was given, documents were examined. The forged letters and the contract with the incorrect signature passed from hand to hand in that courtroom, scrutinized for what they could prove about who had known what and when. Jeanne defended herself. She was, by accounts, a formidable presence in her own defense. She maintained that she had been an intermediary, not the architect. She maintained various things, some of which shifted over the course of the proceedings. Rohan testified that he had been deceived in full, that he had believed every word of the correspondence, that he had met what he took to be the Queen in the Grove, that he had accepted the necklace transaction in good faith as a service to a monarch whose favor he was trying to recover. Nicole Legui d'Oliva testified that she had not fully understood what she was participating in. She was pregnant during the trial. She gave birth in the Bastille while the proceedings continued around her. I think about what the months of that trial felt like from inside it. The papers circulating through Paris. The pamphlets. The public gathering in the arcades of the Palais Royal to trade rumors and versions. The Queen, at Versailles, reading the accounts of what was being said about her, understanding that her name was in every conversation in France, and not in a way she could control. The Cardinal, waiting in the Bastille for a verdict that would tell him what his country thought of him. Jeanne, in the conciergerie, composing her defense, shaping her story. The verdict was delivered on the 31st of May, 1786. Cardinal de Rohan was acquitted of all charges. The Parlement found that he had been deceived. He was required, by royal order, to resign his office as Grand Almoner, and was exiled to his abbey at La Chaise-Dieu, but the legal finding was that he was a victim, not a perpetrator. When the verdict was announced, the streets of Paris celebrated. People gathered. There was, by all accounts, public joy at the acquittal of a cardinal most of Paris had never met, and the joy was not really about Cardinal de Rohan at all. It was a verdict on the Queen. Paris had decided she was guilty of something, even if the court had not said what. Jeanne de la Montvallois was convicted of fraud. She was sentenced to be publicly whipped and branded on both shoulders with the letter V for voleuse, thief. She was to be imprisoned for life in the Salpêtrière. Nicole Legui d'Oliva was acquitted. She left the Bastille with her infant child. Ritou de Villette was sentenced to perpetual banishment from France. Cagliostro was acquitted and subsequently expelled from France by royal order. Nicolas de la Motte, tried in his absence, was sentenced to the galleys for life. He stayed in London, and Marie Antoinette, who had known nothing, who had never touched the necklace, whose name had been stolen and used and put on trial without her participation, received the verdict of an acquittal she had never needed for a crime she had never committed in a court that had found it plausible enough to consider. Chapter 4. Jeanne did not serve her life sentence. In 1787, about a year after the verdict, she escaped from the Salpêtrière. The circumstances are not fully clear from any source. Some accounts suggest she had help from within the prison. Some suggest other assistance. What is clear is that she got out, crossed the Channel, and arrived in London, where her husband was already settled. From London, she published her memoirs in 1788. The title was the Memoires Justificatifs, the Memoirs of Justification. They are, if you read them with the knowledge of what historians now understand about the affair, a remarkable document, not for their accuracy, which is questionable throughout, but for their audacity. Jeanne cast herself as a victim of the Queen's personal malice. She accused Marie Antoinette of direct involvement in the affair, of having orchestrated the necklace transaction for reasons of her own, and then allowing Jeanne to take the punishment for it. Historians, almost without exception, regard these accusations as fabrications. The internal logic of the scheme, which depended entirely on the Queen's ignorance, makes her involvement implausible in a quite fundamental way. The accusation served Jeanne's interests, and it was taken up eagerly by the pamphleteers and revolutionary publicists who were already constructing Marie Antoinette as a figure of corruption, but it was not, as far as the historical record allows us to judge, true. Jeanne died in London in 1791, She fell from a window. She was 34 or 35 years old. Whether it was an accident, whether it was a deliberate act, whether something else entirely happened, the record does not say. She is buried at St. Pancras Old Church in London, though the precise location of her grave is not clearly marked. She left behind the memoirs and a great deal of confusion about who she was and what she had actually done, and that confusion has never entirely resolved. I want to sit with the theories for a while now, because I think they deserve careful handling. The dominant view, the one that most historians have settled on, is that Jeanne was the sole architect of the fraud. She conceived it. She recruited Rétaux de Viette to forge the letters. She recruited Nicole Leguay d'Oliva for the Grove. She managed the necklace transaction through Rohan. She directed the breaking up of the necklace and the disposal of the diamonds. Rohan was her instrument, not her collaborator. The weight of evidence supports this. But there's a question the dominant view doesn't fully answer, and I find myself returning to it. How did she know what she knew? The necklace's existence and price, the detailed protocols of court correspondence, the specific form of royal signature, the layout of the gardens at Versailles, the daily movements of people like Rohan, the rhythms of the jewelers, anxiety. All of this required access to information that a woman in Jeanne's actual position, as opposed to her claimed position, doesn't obviously have. Some historians note that her intelligence gathering must have been considerable and deliberate, and that some of her sources are simply undocumented. This doesn't change the conclusion, but it reminds you that there were parts of the scheme that required more than nerve. The second theory, a minority view, is that Rohan was not entirely deceived, that he had some awareness the situation was irregular and chose to proceed because the potential reward outweighed the risk. The evidence cited for this is mainly the signature, Marie Antoinette de France. A man of Rohan's rank and education, who had spent years at court, would have known the correct form of royal signature. He countersigned the contract. He doesn't appear to have asked about the form. Whether this was negligence, willful credulity, or something more deliberate, the record cannot tell us. The Parlement's verdict found him deceived, and most historians have agreed. But the question of what he truly believed remains genuinely open. It is a question about a person's inner state in a specific moment, standing at a table with a contract in front of him and a signature in the wrong form, and the historical record cannot get inside that moment. The third theory is Jeanne's own, that Marie Antoinette was involved. I've mentioned why historians reject it, but I think it's worth saying why it was believed, and not only by revolutionary pamphleteers. The affair landed in a France already saturated with stories about the Queen's extravagance and her private behavior, stories that ranged from the merely unfair to the completely fabricated. By 1788, when the memoirs appeared, the audience for an accusation against Marie Antoinette was an audience already primed. People believed it not because the evidence was there, but because they had been persuaded, over years, to find it plausible. The affair didn't create that persuasion, but it concentrated it, and gave it a specific and enormously compelling story to attach itself to. This is part of what historians mean when they say the affair of the diamond necklace helped bring down the monarchy. It wasn't that the fraud itself was fatal. It was that the trial, public, followed, debated in every café and arcade in Paris, demonstrated something. The Queen was publicly accused of things she hadn't done, and the court found it worth considering. Rohan's acquittal was celebrated not as justice, but as a vote against her. By the time the verdict was delivered, in May of 1786, the affair had become something larger than a fraud. It had become a test of whether people trusted their queen, and the answer that came back from the streets of Paris was that they didn't. There are things in this story that will never be answered. The diamonds from the necklace, all 647 of them, have never been traced. Nicholas sold some in London. The rest moved through the jewellery trade and disappeared. They are out there, somewhere, set into other pieces, separated from any knowledge of where they came from, scattered across Europe and possibly beyond. The necklace that no one could sell is gone in a way that cannot be undone. The escape from the Salpêtrière remains unexplained. Jeanne's death in London remains unexplained. What Rohan truly believed, in the grove and at the jeweler's table and in the months between, remains genuinely, permanently uncertain. And then there is Marie Antoinette, who outlived all of this by years, who watched the revolution come, who was imprisoned in the Temple and later in the Conciergerie, who was tried before another court and executed by guillotine on the 16th of October, 1793. She is buried at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, north of Paris, where the kings and queens of France have always been interred. The affair was not the cause of the revolution. History is not that simple, and the pressures that broke the French monarchy had been building for decades before 1785. But the affair concentrated something. It gave shape to a suspicion that had been formless. It turned the queen into a figure around whom the worst assumptions clustered and stuck. She spent the rest of her life trying to live with the consequences of a crime she hadn't committed, in a country that had decided on some level that the acquittal was a technicality. I find myself thinking about the letter she burned, Boehmer's letter, in July of 1785, thanking her for the purchase she hadn't made. She read it, couldn't understand it, and burned it, because it seemed like the confused communication of a man she had found troubling. Such a small, ordinary decision. The kind of thing anyone might do with a letter that makes no sense. And it closed the one early window through which the fraud might have been seen and stopped. She couldn't have known what she was burning. That's the thing about the ordinary decisions that turn out to matter. At the moment you make them, they look like nothing at all. Chapter 5. I think about these people, sometimes when I've been sitting with this story for a while. Jeanne de Saint-Remy de Valois, who grew up on the roads of Champagne and died falling from a window in London at 34, in a country that wasn't hers, having published a book of accusations that most people didn't believe. She was, depending on how you weigh it, a brilliant and ruthless opportunist who used the vulnerabilities of a corrupt system against itself, or a woman born into poverty and royal blood who looked at what the world owed her and decided to collect it by other means, or both of those things at once. I think she was both. The intelligence was real, the nerve was extraordinary. The harm she caused was also real, most of all to a woman who had nothing to do with any of it. Cardinal de Rohan died in 1803, in exile, having lived through the Revolution in relative obscurity. He had, in the end, what he had always wanted. The Revolution swept away the court that had excluded him, the protocols that had made his exclusion so visible, the daily ceremony of being present and invisible. By the time all of that was gone, the wanting of it must have seemed very distant. He is buried in Ettenheim, in what is now Germany, far from Versailles and the garden where a stranger handed him a rose in the dark, and he believed what he needed to believe. Nicole Leguay d'Oliva left the Bastille with her baby, and, as far as the historical record shows, returned to her life. She was acquitted. She was young. What happened to her afterward, I can't tell you, because the record stops following her. She moves out of the story and back into ordinary life, which seems, on reflection, like a reasonable thing to do. Rétaux de Villette went into permanent exile and wrote his own account of events. He, too, does not survive very long in the historical record after his banishment. Cagliostro was expelled from France, arrested by the Inquisition in Rome, and died in a papal prison in 1795. Nicolas de la Motte stayed in London and was never returned to face the sentence the French courts had given him in his absence. And Madame Campan, the Queen's First Lady of the Bedchamber, the woman who brought Boehmer's explanation to the Queen and changed the course of events by doing so, outlived them all. She lived through the Revolution, established a school for girls under Napoleon, and eventually wrote her memoirs. The memoirs of the Queen's inner life, the ones historians still read and cite, are campaigns. She was a witness, and she knew it, and she wrote it down, and that writing is one of the reasons we know as much as we do about what Marie Antoinette felt when she understood what had been done in her name. I'm grateful for that. For the witnesses who write things down, who understand they are standing in the middle of history and reach for a pen. The Bosquet de Lorraine still exists within the gardens of Versailles. That is the grove where the meeting took place. The quiet, enclosed space bounded by tall, clipped hedges, reached by narrow gravel paths. On an ordinary day, with few visitors, it is somewhat shadowed, even in summer. The hedges are high enough to screen movement from the main allée. Standing there, it is easy to understand how a meeting in darkness might have lasted only moments, and how a man who needed very badly to believe might have believed. The gravel is the same gravel. The hedges have grown back. The garden does not remember any of them. The necklace is gone. It has been gone since February of 1785, broken up in the days after the transaction. Its 647 diamonds moved out into the world. No image of it in its complete form survives with certainty. It exists now only in written descriptions, in the record of a price no one could pay, and a beauty no one living has ever seen assembled. Somewhere in the world, set into brooches or bracelets or rings with no knowledge of their history, some of those stones may still exist. They don't know what they were part of. They carry no memory of the scheme, the trial, the branding, the burning of a letter on a summer morning by a woman who didn't understand what she was holding. These things pass through the world and leave marks that are not always visible, and then the world closes over them and the garden grows back, and on an ordinary quiet afternoon in the gardens of Versailles, you can stand in the place where something happened and feel only the stillness of the hedges and the gravel underfoot and the light coming through the leaves. Thank you for spending this evening here with me. I hope it brought you some rest. There is more I want to say before we part. I find that with certain stories, once I've followed them all the way through, I end up sitting with them a little longer than I expected to, turning them over, looking at the places where the light falls differently, depending on the angle. This is one of those stories. Let me go back to the theories, because I think I moved through them a little quickly before, and they deserve more time than I gave them. The question of what Rohan knew and when he knew it, and how much he chose to understand is one I keep returning to. The dominant reading is the one the Parlement of Paris landed on. He was deceived. He was a man of genuine faith and considerable credulity in matters close to his heart, and Jeanne exploited that credulity with considerable skill. I don't dispute this. But I think there's a version of the story in which deceived and knowing participant aren't quite the only two options available. Consider what Rohan was being offered. He was being told that the Queen, who had refused to receive him for more than a decade, had begun to change her mind, that she was writing to him, that she wished in secret to restore her favor, that she wanted his help in a discreet financial transaction that, once completed, would cement his rehabilitation in her eyes. Every part of this should have given him pause. A reasonable man, reviewing the evidence with clear eyes, might have asked why the Queen of France was conducting correspondence through an intermediary of no particular standing, why the transaction needed to be secret from the king, why the signature on the contract didn't look quite right. Rohan didn't ask those questions, or if he asked them, he answered them to his own satisfaction without pressing very hard. And I think this is what makes him both a victim and, in some sense, a participant in his own deception. He didn't want to find the holes in the story. The story was too good. After years of being present and invisible at the court of the woman who wouldn't see him, someone had finally appeared and said, "She sees you. She knows you're there. She wants you back." That is not a story a man in that condition subjects to rigorous scrutiny. He gave it the scrutiny it needed to be believed, and no more. This is not the same as saying he knowingly participated in a fraud, but it complicates the simple portrait of a man wholly and innocently deceived. The court found him innocent, and I think the court was right in the strict legal sense. But there is a difference between legal innocence and the absence of any responsibility, and I think Rohan, in his private reflections during the years that followed, probably understood that difference better than he ever said publicly. There is also the question of the forged letters themselves, and I want to stay with this for a moment. Rétaux de Villette wrote them. He had apparently some skill with handwriting, or at least enough skill that the letters passed for authentic with the person who received them. What they contained, in their early form, was cautious, a tentative thaw, an acknowledgment of Rohan's long standing in the official life of the court, a suggestion that the Queen had been thinking about the exclusion, and had come to find it perhaps more absolute than the situation warranted. These are the letters of a careful forger, not an impulsive one. Each letter moved the relationship one step further. There was nothing in the early correspondence that would have required Rohan to commit to anything, to expose himself to anything. The escalation was gradual, the trust built incrementally, the ask held back until the foundation was solid. This is the work of someone who understood how trust is built, and built it deliberately, over months, through the accumulation of small plausibilities. Jeanne understood something about the psychology of correspondence that I find genuinely remarkable. When a person receives a letter they believe is from someone who matters to them, they don't read it the way they'd read a document for errors. They read it the way you read a message from someone you love or admire or desperately want to impress. You are reading for meaning and feeling, not for forensic detail. The warmth of a turn of phrase, the intimacy of a particular word choice. These feel true in a way that the signature line doesn't necessarily register. Rohan was reading for the warmth. He found it every time because Rétaux had been instructed to put it there. I've thought about what it would have felt like to receive those letters. To be a man who had waited years for some sign of acknowledgement, who had maintained his dignity through a decade of ceremonial invisibility, and then to begin receiving, one by one, letters that suggested the thaw was coming. I think they would have felt like relief. Not joy, exactly, not at first. The first few letters probably felt almost too good to be real, and he probably held them carefully, and checked them again, and made himself read them conservatively. Because hope at that level of need is frightening. But after enough letters, after enough consistency, after the warmth had become something he could count on, I think they would have simply become the best part of his day. Something to look forward to, a private comfort in a life that was, in many important ways, publicly diminished. Jeanne knew this too. She knew she was giving him something he couldn't get elsewhere, and that made the thing she was giving him almost impossible to give up voluntarily. The Grove meeting on the night in summer of 1784 was both the climax of the correspondence and its confirmation. The letters had built up to it, and the meeting ratified what the letters had said. After the Grove, Rohan had not just correspondence to hold on to, he had a physical memory. He had stood in the darkness of a garden at Versailles, close enough to a woman he believed was the Queen to accept a flower from her hand. That is a different kind of knowing from words. On paper, it is embodied. It is harder to question. I wonder whether Nicole Leguay d'Oliva was told this when she was recruited. Whether she was told that the success of the scheme depended on the physical reality of the meeting, on Rohan having a sensory memory to fall back on when doubts arose, I don't know. Nicole's own testimony suggests she didn't know the full scope of what she was participating in, and I'm inclined to believe that, both because the court believed it and because giving Nicole the full picture would have been an unnecessary risk for Jeanne. You don't tell people more than they need to know. Jeanne knew this. What Nicole knew was enough to place her in white clothing in a dark garden, to speak a few words to an approaching figure, to hand over a rose and then withdraw when interrupted. That was all that was required of her. She performed it. She probably didn't know until much later, if ever she fully understood it, what that performance had been worth to the scheme she was embedded in. Her acquittal was the right outcome, I think. She was a young woman, pregnant, recruited into something she didn't fully understand, who did what she was asked, and paid for it with months in the Bastille, and a trial whose outcome she couldn't predict. The court saw that. The 64 judges, for all the messiness of the proceedings, saw the difference between the woman who had designed the scheme and the young woman who had stood in a grove in white for a few minutes and then gone home. Her child was born in the Bastille. I keep coming back to that. A baby born inside one of the most famous prisons in France, during a trial that was being followed by every reading person in the country, to a mother who didn't fully understand how she'd ended up there. And then the verdict came, and Nicole was acquitted, and she walked out with her baby and back into her ordinary life. The historical record stops following her at that point. She becomes one of the people who moves through a famous event and then returns to anonymity, which is what most people in history do, and which is, in the end, the reasonable thing to do. I hope her life was quieter after that. I genuinely do. Now let me return to Jeanne one more time, because I don't think I've fully done justice to the complexity of what she was. She was, in the simplest account, a fraudster. She conceived and executed a fraud that cost the jewelers Baumer and Bassenge $1.5 million livres, that sent a cardinal to the Bastille, that resulted in her own conviction and branding, and that damaged the reputation of a queen who had nothing to do with it. The harm she caused was real, and the deliberateness of it was real. But Jeanne de Saint-Remy de Valois was also a woman who had been told, repeatedly, through legitimate channels, that what she was owed was not quite sufficient to be worth paying. She had royal blood and a documented lineage, and she had filed the petitions and waited for the answers, and the answers had been, in various polite ways, no. The system had evaluated her and found her not quite worth the effort of accommodation, and she had looked at the same system and decided to use it differently. There is something in the architecture of the fraud that I find striking. She didn't invent an entirely fictitious scenario. She used things that were real. Rohan's exclusion was real. The necklace existed and was looking for a buyer. The protocols of court correspondence were real, and she had studied them carefully. The Queen's known habits and preferences and daily routines were real information, gathered and applied. The fraud was constructed from accurate components. Only the authorization was false. That requires a particular kind of intelligence. You can be clever in ways that are purely inventive, building something from nothing. What Jeanne did required a different kind of cleverness. Reading an existing system, identifying its pressure points, understanding which real elements could be assembled in a pattern that produced a false but plausible conclusion. That is the work of a careful mind, and however one feels about what she did with it, the mind behind it was real, and it was hers, and she had developed it without any of the educational advantages that Rohan or the Queen or most of the people in her story had taken for granted. She grew up begging on the roads of Champagne, By her late 20s, she was directing a complex fraud involving forged royal correspondence, a nocturnal meeting in the royal gardens, and 1.5 million livres in diamonds. The distance between those two facts is extraordinary. The route she took to travel it was not one anyone would recommend. But the journey itself reflects something about the kind of person she was, and I don't think the story is well served by flattening her into a simple villain. She was complicated, she was harmful, she was also, in her way, remarkable. And then she was 34 years old, in a foreign city, and she fell from a window, and it was over. I want to return to Marie Antoinette one final time, because I think she often gets lost in the telling of this story. The affair is named after the necklace, not after her, but she is the one who paid the highest price for it, over the longest period of time. She was 29 when the necklace changed hands. She was executed 8 years later, in 1793, in the courtyard of the Conciergerie, by guillotine. In the 8 years between those events, she watched the world she had known collapse entirely, watched the court and the ceremonial and the Versailles she had lived in for 20 years disappear, watched her husband executed 9 months before she was, watched her children taken from her. She died at 37. The affair of the necklace was not the cause of any of this. I want to be clear about that, because the story can sometimes be told in a way that implies a direct line from the fraud to the revolution, and the line is not that direct. The revolution had roots that went deeper than any single scandal, in debt and taxation and social inequality, and the accumulated grievances of a country whose institutions had failed it in ways that went far beyond one woman and one necklace. But the affair concentrated something. It gave the existing suspicion of the Queen a specific, dramatic story to attach itself to. Before the affair, the pamphlets against Marie Antoinette were vague in their accusations: extravagance, foreign influence, inappropriate private behavior. After the affair, there was a story, a cardinal, a necklace, a trial, an acquittal that Paris celebrated as though it were a verdict against the Queen herself. The affair didn't create the suspicion, but it crystallized it in a form that was hard to dislodge. And she couldn't dislodge it, because you cannot prove a negative in public opinion the way you can prove it in a courtroom. She was acquitted, in effect, by a court that found the charges against her unsupported. But the acquittal didn't reach the people who had already decided. In the cafes and arcades and pamphlet shops of Paris, the story had already settled into its shape, and the shape was not in her favor. She spent the rest of her life knowing that, and there was nothing she could do about it. Madame Campan wrote about her during this period, and the portrait she gives is of a woman who understood the damage that had been done and who lived with that understanding every day. She was not passive. She wrote letters to her family in Austria, to her brother the emperor, explaining what had happened, asking for support, trying to manage the perception of events from a distance. She attended the public ceremonies that her position required, and performed them, as she always had, with whatever dignity she could maintain. She continued her private life at the Petit Trianon as far as was still possible. She mothered her children. She was a person doing her best to live a life that had been significantly damaged by something she hadn't done, in a country that wasn't quite willing to accept her account of the damage. That is a kind of loneliness that is hard to describe from the outside. Campan, writing about her years later, after the revolution had come and gone and the Queen was long dead, was careful to preserve what she could of the inner person she had known. The warmth in private company, the genuine pleasure in her children, the particular laugh she had when she was genuinely amused, as opposed to the formal smile required by the state apartments. The way she moved through the Petit Trianon, as though she could breathe more easily there. Campion had watched all of this, had been present for it, and had written it down, and the writing is one of the reasons it has survived. I'm grateful to Campion for that. For choosing to record the person rather than only the events. For understanding that the events meant something because of the person they happened to, and that the person deserved to survive in the record as more than a symbol or a casualty. The gardens of Versailles are still there. Most of the main alleys, the grand formal spaces that Louis XIV designed as an outdoor extension of the palace's ceremonial life, are largely intact. The Bosquet de la Reine, the enclosed grove where the meeting took place, stands within the park. It is quieter than the main paths. The hedges are tall. The gravel is fine underfoot. On an ordinary day in summer, with the light filtered through the canopy and few visitors on the side paths, it has the feeling of an interior space, a room made of living green, where sounds from beyond the hedges are muffled and movement is screened. You can stand there and understand very easily how darkness would have completed the enclosure, how a figure in white, positioned correctly, would have been the only thing visible in the grove, how the meeting could have lasted its few moments and then been over, leaving a man walking back through the gardens with a rose in his hand, in a belief he wasn't going to examine too carefully. The gardens were designed to produce exactly this kind of feeling. The enclosed bosquets were pleasure spaces, meant for private gathering away from the formality of the main terraces, spaces where the court could breathe a little more freely, where encounters could happen that the state apartments wouldn't permit. The designers of Versailles understood that power needs its private rooms as well as its public ones. They built those rooms in the garden, enclosed them in hedges, gave them gravel floors and cool shade and the sound of water from nearby fountains. They were not designed for fraud, but they were designed for privacy, and privacy, in the wrong hands, becomes a useful tool. The necklace remains gone. This is the part one keep coming back to at the end. Not metaphorically gone, not lost in the archival sense, but physically dispersed, broken up in the days after the transaction, the stones separated from each other and from any documentation of their origin, and sent out into the jewelry trade of late 18th century Europe. 647 diamonds. Some of them may still exist, set into pieces that have changed hands many times since, with no record of where they came from. Someone, somewhere, may own a piece of Georgian jewelry that contains a stone from the most famous necklace in the history of the French monarchy, and have no way of knowing it. The stone has no memory, it carries no mark. There is something quietly significant about that, I think. All of this, the years of construction, the legal negotiations, the fraud, the trial, the branding, the revolution, the Queen's execution, the pamphleteers, the memoirs, the theories that historians are still weighing, all of it flows from an object that no longer exists. The necklace is the center of everything, and it has been gone for more than 2 centuries. What remains is the story, and the people in it, and the damage they did to each other and to themselves, and the garden where the hedges have grown back, and the gravel continues to be raked, and the afternoon light comes through the leaves as though nothing particular ever happened there. I find that somehow appropriate, not consoling exactly, but appropriate. Some things are too large for the object they attach themselves to, and this is one of them. The necklace was only ever a mechanism. What it carried, the ambition and the desperation and the credulity and the injury, those things were already there, waiting for a mechanism to organize them. The necklace provided the shape. The shape is gone. The things it organized have lasted. I think of Jeanne in London in the years after her escape, writing her memoirs by whatever light she had available, constructing her version of the story for an audience she knew was already inclined to believe the worst about the Queen. Whatever else she was, she understood narrative. She understood that the person who writes the account shapes the account. She was wrong about what she said, or at least historians believe she was, but she wasn't naive about what she was doing. She was, until the end, still trying to close the distance between what she was owed and what the world would give her. She had tried the proper channels. She had tried fraud on a grand scale. In her final years, she tried the press. None of it, in the end, was enough. She was 34 or 35 when she fell from that window in London in 1791. The same year, the revolution in France was beginning to accelerate toward its most violent phase. Marie Antoinette was still alive then, still imprisoned at the Tuileries, not yet transferred to the Temple. The world that had formed both of them, the court at Versailles, the diamond trade, the pamphlet culture, the elaborate theater of monarchical France, was in the process of ending. By the time it had fully ended, both women were gone. They had, in a sense, been in each other's stories from the moment Jeanne arrived at Versailles and began presenting herself as a person of consequence. They never met. Marie Antoinette almost certainly never knew Jeanne's name until the moment Campan brought her Boehmer's explanation, and possibly didn't know it fully until the arrest. They occupied the same world without ever sharing it, which is to say that Jeanne occupied the margins of a world whose center was Marie Antoinette, and the fraud was, among other things, an act of reaching across that distance and taking something from the center without being admitted to it. The taking worked. The getting away with it didn't. Let me close with the people, because that's where the story began and where it should end. Jeanne de Saint-Rémy de Valois. She had royal blood and a sharp mind and no money and a nerve that was, by any measure, remarkable. She used all of those things in ways that caused real harm to people who didn't deserve it, and to at least one person, Marie Antoinette, who had already been harmed enough by circumstances she hadn't chosen. I hold both of those things at once when I think of her. The injury she caused, and the life she had come from, and the distance between the two. I don't excuse the harm. I do try to understand the person who caused it. Marie Antoinette of Austria, Queen of France. She came to Versailles at 14, and she was buried at Saint-Denis at 37. And the years between those events contained more ceremony and more loneliness and more genuine pleasure in small private things than most accounts make room for. She didn't buy the necklace. She didn't commission the fraud. She didn't write the letters or arrange the meeting in the grove. She burned a confusing letter she didn't understand, and later she sat in a room with her husband and heard what had been done in her name, and she spent the rest of her life in the long shadow of an accusation she couldn't entirely dispel. That is not a small thing to carry. I think of her with respect, and with something that feels, honestly, like sorrow. The Bosquet de la Reine is quiet this evening, I imagine. The hedges dark, the gravel pale in the late light. The fountains elsewhere in the garden sending their sounds across the alleys, but muffled here, inside the green walls. No one standing in the grove, tonight. Just the evening settling over the garden as it has settled for 300 years, patient and continuous, remembering nothing. Thank you for being here tonight. I hope the story settled gently around you. Rest well. A peaceful night to you.